So in this video we're going to be doing a deep dive into the cognitive network of the ISTP, taking a cognitive function based approach in order to give you 5 signs you probably are not this type. First, we need to get something out of the way. This type is a cognitive introvert rather than a cognitive extrovert, which means that cognition is primarily proactive rather than reactive. Now, proactive cognition does not mean proactive behavior, but it does mean thoughts tend to occur first. So we're left with a type who tends to spend more time on average simulating realities than spending time immersed within this one. So let's jump into it, starting with sign number 1. You probably are not an ISTP, the TiNi dominant pairing. Now, I want to address an elephant in the room here. Have you ever noticed how the majority of introverted thinking definitions tend to line up way more with introverted thinking within an INTP rather than ISTP? Well, there's actually a good reason for this. You see, introverted thinking definitions, by and large, are biased towards the precise and analytic style of thought of the INTP, rather than the more broad and generalistic TI style of the ISTP. Whereas INTPs have TISI, which is a precise form of TI. ISTPs have TiNi, that is, introverted thinking, introverted intuition. Working in unison, would you believe it? You see, introverted intuition is naught but a broad lens directed internally. All of the wishy-washy associations we have with introverted intuition, whether true or not, come about just as a result of the broad internal lens's need for a kind of cohesive internal narrative structure. TiNi is, after all, more about breadth than depth. We are not looking at precise nitpicking here, or even something particularly mathematical. Instead, we have an introverted thinking which is a lot more vague in nature, operating on a larger scale as it seeks to align multiple concepts into a single cohesive unity. Indeed, TiNi is not a pairing that likes to get bogged down in the details of lexical precision. Instead, this pairing, or function, as it were, because functions are only functional when they're paired together in CPT, tends to operate at a much faster pace than TISI, jumping from one conclusion to the next. Reverse engineering these conclusions, however, tends to be much harder for this type for that reason. And it is likely due to this kind of conclusion-driven speed that ISTPs often mistype as NE-centric types, such as the ENTP. You see, Ni and Ne can be very easily confused with one another, especially since a lot of definitions operate more upon general symptoms that we associate with certain things rather than the kind of quintessential phenomenological essence. If you find yourself instead favouring analytical precision, leaving no stone unturned in your quest for logical distillation, INTP, or indeed ISFP, another TISI-based type, would be better worth considering. If you find yourself instead in a kind of rush to the finish line, jumping from one logical conclusion to the next one, perhaps towards a conceptual innovation or grand synthesis, ISTP is worth considering. And I still think Bruce Lee is to this day one of the best examples of TiNi in practice. Yeah, a little bit more extroverted in that case, but broad and general synthesis definitely ruled the day. And I would also add that TiNi has a much more vague speaking style than TISI. So if you are often asked to repeat yourself or be more specific with your words, ISTP is a good thing to consider. Sign number 2 that you probably aren't an ISTP, introverted intuition, agency. Unlike the more Ni exploratory, Ni dominant, or the Ni relentless, Ni authority type, such as ENFJ, the ISTP has Ni in agency position. You see, in CPT, the system you're watching right now, we grade functions based on their position rather than their strength or degrees of unconsciousness. You see, this introverted intuition within an ISTP is no stronger or weaker than the Ni of any other type. And I honestly think judging functions based upon how much you're using them or not using them is somewhat of a fallacy, at least within a kind of single type basis. So the agency position is essentially the ultimate all-in position, epitomizing someone who will dedicate everything, no matter even the sacrifice, to a particularly strong muse. And this is why ISTPs have the often reached potential to become masters of their craft. It's not because of some supposed TISE interaction, as much as it is simply a result of introverted intuition exerting a kind of will when it is in this position. So typically within this type, you would not find the broad and general knowledge that you'd find within more NI compulsive types, such as ENTJ and INTJ. Instead, this type tends to specialize, home in, within introverted intuition. And outside of a few niche areas, when you're talking to them, NI might be quite hard to gauge in the first place. But if you happen to catch this type in their comfort zone, you'll probably find a high degree of NI insight and broad synthesis between areas you may have otherwise considered unrelated. The NI agency of this type is what makes them gifted innovators. Introverted intuition, where it gazes, is fully under this type's control. And much like the Eye of Sauron, not an ISTP, but I never pass up the opportunity for a good Lord of the Rings reference, homes into the point of greatest interest and passion. So what tends to occur with the NI agency type, I think ISTP and ISFP, is the ultimate locking in. This could be to a desirable outcome, an idea of the self, a kind of social archetype, for example, or it could be to a hyper-interest, or indeed all three. Indeed, the introverted intuition of such types tends to be so exacting as to result in a kind of blindness to information outside of its scope or preferred narrative. Which leads us to the next point. Sign number 3 that you probably are not an ISTP, the extroverted intuitive blind spot. So with all of the fixation upon a grand narrative, this type can get blindsided to information outside that structure. In fact, they can become so reliant upon their own frameworks, be them skill-based or knowledge-based or otherwise, so as to fail to grasp the big picture outside of their model. Think Elon Musk and the promises he made about self-driving cars coming the following year for multiple years. Also a good example of TiNi kind of sweeping over details in its mad rush for a grand synthesis. However, CPT does go a little bit deeper and specifies the furthest extreme of a blindness within a type. Because you see, the any blind spot within an ISTP is different to that of an ISFP. Whereas the ISFPs is more TE accentuated, the ISTPs is more FE accentuated. And as a result, ISTPs don't tend to manifest the kind of idealism that ISFPs have. But they do manifest more reliance upon their own frameworks for social utility. So that means when they quote social situations their framework does not account for, they do tend to have a very difficult time adjusting. In fact, unless the type's TiNi is extremely internalized, such as the case of Musk over there, this type isn't actually all that blind to TeNe at all. Instead, think group settings or more dynamic social occasions, or indeed quickly establishing myriad new relationships with people, or embedding oneself within a community. As charismatic as they can be within certain mediums, it is rather easy to catch this type socially flat-footed, which is actually one of the reasons why they often present a kind of cool lone wolf persona, so as to avoid dynamic social exchanges altogether. Social improvisation is, in general, this type's Achilles heel, one that they will often compensate for by adopting a kind of consistent social archetype, or being hyper-selective with the people they choose to spend time around anyway. Indeed, I'd actually say ISTPs are the most selective out of all of the types. Another symptom of FENE blindness tends to be an absence of interest or even curiosity about individuals outside a very narrow FESE scope. And when I say FESE scope, I mean a narrower, more constrained scope of social interaction. So if you instead find yourself taking social improvisation and new social settings in your stride, perhaps even bouncing from one new acquaintance to the next one, ISTP is pretty unlikely. So number 4 that you are not an ISTP, the FESE opposing pairing. But on the other side of these function dynamics is the extroverted feeling energies dedicated towards that extroverted sensing lens. This results in an extremely sensitive FESE opposing pairing that is a lot more switched on to social nuances and mirror empathy than the type is often given credit for. I'd say the sensitivity of ISTPs across the board is one of their most underrated qualities. This often makes them good, if not a little bit dismissive, judge of characters, and also makes them very, very picky with whom they spend their time. And as with their ENFJ cousins, the type is also, as a general tendency, hypersensitive to how other people perceive them. and in many ways even more so than the Fe dominant equivalent, due to the discomfort this type tends to have with actively managing their reputation. This type does tend to take feedback to heart, and will yet put a lot of TI-based effort into ensuring a kind of general framework that does not tread upon too many toes. And this is another reason why TeNe often manifests a kind of social archetype, such as the kind of lone wolf archetype I referred to before. All of this takes the pressure off Fe, or that is to say Fe convergence, and Fe that one actually interacts with rather than observes. One pattern I've noticed, especially among ISTP musicians, is to develop a kind of cool and sophisticated introverted persona that is pretty effortless to maintain. But irrespective of whatever cool persona you may give off, if you find yourself largely unaffected by what other people think of you, and perhaps even extremely walled off to the social harmony outside yourself, ISTP is pretty unlikely. Sign number 5, you are not an ISTP. The extroverted feeling, oppositional. You see, the caveat of this very hypersensitivity tends to lie in the relative rigidity of this position. While ISTPs can certainly flip on their axis into a more lively ENFJ or even ENTP, at their network theory reference, cognition, they tend to do so in very short bursts, and they're often knackered afterwards. And when I say knackered, I mean like taking days away from people and just being unable to socialise. And just as a side note, you might notice how, contrary to the last point, ISTPs can actually become very moody and blunt with people when they are drained. The emphasis of a hyperdivergent focal point is, after all, observation and TI adherence to that which is observed. And this can cause a type to feel compulsively constrained by social parameters and unwilling to loosen up or open up to all but the most trusted of confidence. And I would mention, when ISTPs do open up, they tend to surpass even my own eccentricity. Generally, cognitive traits you can associate with the oppositional position are kind of clunkiness and general kind of discomfort and withdrawal from social disharmony. Even more than INTPs, ISTPs are hypersensitive to negative social energies. But similarly, they are also very sensitive to external social motivation. Indeed, ISTPs are often one of the types who spend more time than other types seeking kind of motivation from the words of others, from speeches, for example. But when confronted with negative social energies, ISTPs can kind of lock up into a state of social paralysis. And if such sensitivity does not sound like you, and you tend to take command over disharmonious social situations in your stride, ISTP is less likely. Bonus point, the extroverted thinking, extroverted intuitive dip. One thing that I've so far neglected to mention in this video is the amazing potential this type has for external systemization. You may recall the TeNe dip from my ENFJ video. Well, unlike with the ENFJ, TeNe here is entered from the expression gateway rather than the extension gateway. That is, it represents a kind of expression of an introverted pairing into an extroverted one, rather than one extroverted pairing going into another. TeNe essentially represents the completion of this type's TiNi frameworks. Once a dominant pairing is complete in its process, one can naturally express it to express itself into reality. So the type essentially becomes so confident in their objective frameworks that they can be easily expressed into the outer world. And as extroverted intuition encompasses a wide breadth, so here does TE. And this is actually where the type tends to get their engineering or virtuoso stereotype. Imagine any perceiving a large swath of the external landscape and controlling many different variables in a kind of dynamic interchange. And it's not that these stereotypes with ISTP always hold true. In fact, I'd even say more often than not, they do not. But they do represent a latent extroverted potential within an otherwise introverted type. In a nutshell, the TeNe dip of this type allows them to take command of an external world they have already TiNi accounted for. And this is where TiNi does very much translate to mastery of skill sets, but not just mastery, but often synthesis, completion, innovation. But this does not mean the type is a TeNe dominant by any stretch of the imagination, unless the type is a particularly ambiverted subtype. Generally, TiNi must kind of build a foundation of reality. So rather than kind of jumping into the thick of it and taking reality in their stride, ISTPs generally get a very large and cohesive, if not a little vague, framework that can account for things they have not yet seen or experienced. So if you consider your extroverted thinking more kind of narrow and precise, perhaps focusing more upon the details or artistic nuances, for example, rather than trying to bring many different components into singular unison, it is less likely you are this time. So that concludes the video. I hope it's been useful, and if you know anyone who you suspect might or might not be an ISTP, be sure to share this video with them. If you are still uncertain about what your type might be, who are interested in my coaching services, be sure to check out cognitivepersonality.com. And if you'd like to support the channel on an additional level, please head over to the Patreon page as well. So that's it from me, and I'll be back in a few weeks' time. For now, take care.